From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. For those of you who are not of the Library of Congress, I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, which is the reading promotion arm of the library. We promote books, reading, literacy in libraries, and we also work hard at promoting the historical study of books, reading, literacy in libraries. We were created in 1977 by Daniel Borston when he was the Librarian of Congress, who felt the Library of Congress should be playing a more public role in the world of books and in the world of book promotion. We exist primarily both around the country through a network of state centers for the book, which are housed in and hosted by either state libraries, large public library systems, and increasingly by state humanities councils. And they promote books and reading and really local authors in their states. And many of them have state book festivals, many of them patterned after the National Book Festival, for which the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress does have a major responsibility. We also work with literacy groups around the country. And as I said, we have a major responsibility for the author program for the National Book Festival. And I'm pleased our announcement is out with the preliminary selection of authors, and the book festival this year has been expanded to 2 days. It will be September 22nd and September 23rd. There's a whole row down here, so come on down. Thanks. But here at the Library of Congress, this Books and Beyond series has been one of our major ways of calling attention that Library of Congress books are often produced by Library of Congress staff members, but the emphasis overall in the Books and Beyond would be to celebrate printed books, new books that have a special relationship to the Library of Congress. Quite often it's the resources of the Library of Congress, but in other cases there is a number of, if Library of Congress staff members are involved, we want to call attention to this, and we want to celebrate books and reading in any way that we can. And this is really only in my tenure as the director of the Center for the Book, which has lasted since 1977 when the center was created. I can only really recall one other program with CRS, and I'm not going to mention it. I'm going to praise this program, which we are looking forward to. All of the presentations in the Books and Beyond series are recorded for a future webcast on the Library of Congress website. So I ask you to please turn off all things electronic. The speakers will finish at with about 20 minutes before 1 or so, when we can have a question and answer period. But I want you to note that if you ask a question during the Q&A, that you are giving your permission and your consent perhaps to be part of our webcast. I'm going to begin by introducing the volume editor, Jacob Straus, who is an analyst with this Congressional Research Service here at the library. Jacob has been here 5 years, and I commented with the other speakers that this is really a new crew for me for the CRS. My first 2 years at the Library of Congress full-time job was in CRS when I was in the old Library Services unit. And I still know Marjorie Brown and a few others who were there. Walter is here, Olzek, but those are the folks that I remembered. And it's really refreshing to meet some new people. And I also want to say that I was delighted to see the book and to understand that the book had really been obviously approved by the Library of Congress and by CRS and had been encouraged, because it's a way, in my view, of sharing our expert knowledge from CRS and also mixing it with other relevant parts of the world, in this case of political science, government, legislative procedure, in a way that is good for the Library of Congress. And it's good, in my view, that people know we have experts here and that they are able to produce such a fine volume as this one. Jacob has told me he will, in his introduction, talk about the background of the book. Let me finish off with Jacob's background. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland, and his master's and PhD degrees from the University of Florida. He was an assistant professor of political science at Frostburg State in Maryland, and currently is adjunct professor of political science at the Johns Hopkins University and at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County Shady Groves campus, which is a mouthful. But Jacob is going to give background and then introduce his colleagues who will complete the presentation. Let's welcome Jacob Straus, who must be an innovator to get this book published.
Well, thank you, John, for those kind introductory remarks. I don't know about an innovator, maybe a miracle worker. I want to just start with a sort of a standard thing that we do. And all the authors who are from CRS who helped contribute to this volume, we did this on our own time. And so the views that are reflected in the chapters and in our presentations here today for Matt, Colleen, and I are ours and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Congressional Research Service or the Library of Congress. That out of the way, we can actually talk about the book. This project began out of a conference at the Midwest Political Science Association annual meeting several years ago on a panel that was tangentially related to party and procedure. It turned out that one of the 4 papers that were presented on that panel actually made it into the book. The others, for various reasons, did not. And I was very lucky to be able to draw on many of my colleagues in CRS, as well as many of my colleagues outside of the library in political science, to come up with what I think is a very good volume that focuses on political parties and how they use procedure in Congress to push their agenda. As you probably know, political parties are an essential building block of a modern Congress. It's hard to imagine Congress today without political parties as a basis of organization and operations. So the idea of the book was how parties and their leadership use procedure to influence legislation, and really focuses on 4 questions about parties in Congress. And you'll see these themes throughout the 2 presentations that we're going to have today, as well as if you buy the book and read the book, throughout all the chapters, which is agenda setting, decision making, strategy, and compromise. So let me talk a little bit about sort of the overall themes of the book. And ultimately, in Congress, there are 3 major centers of power, right, which are listed here on the screen: political parties, committees, and congressional leadership. So I want to touch on each of these a little bit and just sort of bring you a little bit of background information before we move on to highlight the rest of the volume and then introduce my co-presenters here today. Political parties didn't always exist, right? Historically, they didn't exist in the first Congress. And for the first several Congresses, political parties, if they existed at all, were very weak coalitions of members. Individual members dominated those early Congresses. There's a wonderful story that Joe Ellis tells in his book, Founding Brothers, about James Madison and the role that he played in pushing through the debt assumption legislation that Alexander Hamilton wanted when he was Secretary of the Treasury. It was his individual personality, Ellis makes pretty clear, that drove the ability to adopt that legislation and then to have the national government adopt state Revolutionary War debt. So even though they were informal, these parties began to form almost immediately. And the major parties of the early time period, the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans, organized themselves within Congress in an effort to protect the respective parties' self-interest. So today, as I said, it's hard to imagine Congress, or politics for that matter, without parties, although certainly some of us, and you read in the paper, wish that parties didn't exist sometimes. Committees are the second thing. Committees, who are led by chairs, congressional committees, have traditionally derived their power from both political parties and from chamber rules. Committee assignments generally come from the political parties, and then the rules of of jurisdiction and other things come from the chambers. Committees can yield tremendous power over legislation, since almost every bill historically has been referred to at least one committee within either the House or the Senate. Committees are also places where bills can be negotiated out of the spotlight. and Colleen will highlight this in a few minutes during her talk on defense authorization. Last, congressional leaders, which Matt is going to talk about next. Being a leader can be quite a desirable thing. There are resources and other advantages that come with that. You command media attention. In the House especially, you have the opportunity to control the legislative agenda and what gets scheduled on the House floor. And the Speaker of the House, who everyone knows, is an evolving institution. It used to be in the early 1900s that the Speaker controlled everything, right? Committee assignments, virtually everything. Then the membership rose up, overthrew Speaker Cannon, and today we end up in a system of sort of hybrid where the Speaker controls many things, including a lot of resources, but does not have an absolute control over everything else that goes on in the chamber. The other two themes that are prevalent throughout the book are these two: majority agenda control and minority rights. In the House especially, the majority has almost universal control over scheduling of legislation. In the Senate, that situation is a little bit more complicated, and Colleen will touch on that a little bit in her talk. And in the Senate, or agenda control in general, not specifically in the Senate, is generally conceived to be, in the political science literature, more negative. It's easier in modern Congress to keep things off of the agenda than it is to sometimes place things on the agenda. Minority rights is the last piece of this. Again, the literature tells us that minority members theoretically must have some right to change or attempt to change legislation in order for a legislature to be successful. And that ability varies over legislatures. Some minorities have very realistic opportunities for change, and others are only can make noise. They can only sort of raise issues, but nothing is actually going to happen. Congress, the U.S. Congress, is somewhere in the middle, right, where there are absolutely real opportunities for change, but there's also a degree of noise that being in the minority has to it. And over time, minority rights have changed, and today, minority power is greater partly because of media. Right? The ability to go to the media to get your message across can change the dynamic of a majority-minority relationship within Congress. Regardless of whether the minority is strong or not strong, the House and Senate provide numerous tools that allow the minority to attempt to amend legislation, and the part of this volume focuses on that as well. So overall, the volume is divided into 4 sections, I thought in a logical way. Leadership, the House, the Senate, and then legislative reconciliation, how the House and Senate come to terms to agree to get a piece of legislation to become law. As you know or may know, you have to have exactly the same language and exactly the same legislative vehicle, the same bill number, right, in order for a bill to become law or to go to the president for his signature. So that chapter focuses on that. Each chapter is a unique contribution to the literature on political parties and to Congress. All right, so I just wanted to highlight a few of the chapters that will not be presented here today. One is there's a chapter on examining the creation and abandonment of a House rule, which is known as King or Queen of the Hill rules, written by Jim Saturno. I wrote a chapter, which I won't be discussing here, on the adoption of electronic voting in the 1970s and how that's changed roll call voting, the recording of votes in the House of Representatives. We were lucky enough to have a former member of Congress, Congressman Major Owens, write a chapter on the Congressional Black Caucus and his observations from his time as a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, dealing in legislative negotiations within the Democratic Party. I also want to note that Congressman Owens, as far as I understand, and John confirms this as far as he understands, is the only librarian to have ever served in Congress. So we were very lucky to have him contribute to this volume. We were equally lucky to have James Wallner, who is a Senate staff member, write a chapter on procedural tools. James' chapter actually is not listed here. It's about agreement in the chamber and that more things happen in the Senate than the media gives it credit for. The Congressional Toolkit is written by some folks at Duke, led by David Rhodey, and it's sort of a soup to nuts discussion of things available to the Senate to try and push a legislative agenda by the party leaders. And last, I want to highlight Walter Olzik, who, as John has already mentioned, and his son Mark wrote a wonderful analysis of the healthcare reform efforts in the 111th Congress. And my students last semester at UMBC thought it was wonderful too, so it's not just me. All right, so as the editor of this book, my role is to organize and facilitate the wonderful chapters found in the volume. The real work, however, was done by the contributors. Two of them are here with us today to share their work, and I want to introduce them to you now. First up will be Matt Glassman. He's also an analyst with CRS, where he focuses on congressional operations and administration and congressional history. Personal research interests include institutional design and 19th century American political development. He received his PhD from Yale. Colleen Shogan will come second, is the Assistant Director of the Government and Finance Division at CRS. Previously, she was an assistant professor at George Mason University in Virginia and an American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow in the Senate, as well as a legislative assistant in the Senate. She's author of several journal articles and a book on presidential rhetoric, and like Matt, also received her PhD from Yale. So I also want to mention that both Matt and Colleen have those two things in similar. They work at CRS. They're both political scientists. They both got degrees from Yale. They're also both working on novels. So they asked me to mention that. And of course, writing novels in a fiction sense is completely different than writing in a political science or a governmental sense. But they're projects I'm interested in reading both of them. So I now turn over the presentation to Matt and Colleen, and they will both be available for questions following their presentation. Matt?
Thanks. So I'm going to talk about congressional leadership, and as you can see there, the title of my chapter and talk was Congressional Leadership, a Resource Perspective. Well, what does that mean? I got interested in this back after the 2010 election. If you remember, the Republicans won the election, won control of the House, and as such, the Democrats lost the speakership position, which meant the total number of leaders they could have in their caucus was reduced by one. Ms. Pelosi suggested that she would run for minority leader and not step aside, meaning that the next three positions, or the next two positions rather, minority whip and caucus chair, were going to come down to three people. Okay. Representative Clyburn and Representative Hoyer both decided they were going to run for whip. A short campaign commenced in which they sought the support of their caucuses, and Pelosi stood in the middle trying to bargain away the situation such that there wouldn't be a divisive vote in the caucus. As it turns out, they were able to avoid such a divisive vote, as Mr. Hoyer was named whip, and Mr. Clyburn was given a new position called Assistant Minority Leader, or Assistant to the Minority Leader, perhaps. So the question becomes, what exactly did Mr. Clyburn get in this settlement? And what did he lose? Well, one way to think about it is the way Mr. Clyburn thought about it. He said, I got a seat at the table in the leadership. I'll be there helping make decisions. And that's certainly true, although that kind of raises a secondary question. Who cares? You could be given a seat at the table whether you had a formal leadership position or not, and you could be cut out of the leadership table whether you had a formal position or not. And so I started thinking about it institutionally, thinking about this race as a fight over formal authority and resources of the position, of the whip position. Well, what is the formal authority of the whip position? There's not a lot of formal authority to being minority whip in the House rules, and there's basically the same zero authority in the Democratic caucus rules themselves. So what is the whip position from an institutional perspective? And what it turns out it is, if you get right down to brass tacks, is it's $1.7 million. Okay? That's the amount of money the minority whip gets in Congress to buy himself staff. He also gets a 3-room suite in the Capitol building. Okay? And so from there, I said, well, why is this important? Okay? Well, for these two men, it was very important because they both came from such positions of power already. Okay? Mr. Hoyer had been majority leader. Mr. Clyburn had been majority whip, and those positions came with $2.5 million and $2.1 million respectively, okay, prior to the 2010 election. And if they were to win this position they were fighting for, they would get the $1.7 million due the minority whip, and if they lost, they'd get nothing. That is to say, their resources from leadership would be zero, and they would be left to rely on the resources they had in their personal offices, or if they were due any committee staff or other resources. Okay? And so Following from this sort of illustration, the remainder of my talk wants to discuss leadership in the context of these resources. Okay? Theoretically, how do they work to operate? What is the power of them? Okay? And then we'll take a look at what they actually are. What are the material resources of House and Senate leadership right now? And then how has that changed over time? So the first question is, what makes a leader more or less powerful? Okay? And the oldest view on this, and kind of the traditional view, is it's individual skill. Okay? LBJ was a powerful majority leader in the Senate because, gosh darn it, he was LBJ. Okay? And when Mansfield took over, Mansfield was a weak leader because he was Mike Mansfield and not LBJ. Okay? Assembling coalitions is a difficult task, and leaders can't sit around and wait. They have to do things. Okay? And in this view, if you're able to do things, if you're able to give people the treatment and really work them in the cloakroom, you can have a lot of success. And that's certainly some truth to this view. Of course, a more modern view and a more political science view is that the institutional structure of the chambers is an important ingredient to powerful leadership. Okay? Leaders are empowered by their caucuses in the House and Senate, who adjust the formal rules of the chambers to either make the leaders more powerful or not. So Speaker Cannon is very powerful because the rules of the House said he could hand select every committee member. Can you imagine if Speaker Boehner had that power now? Okay? And likewise, Speaker Rayburn is less powerful because his caucus was divided, couldn't agree on much, but knew they did not want a strong Leviathan hanging over him. Instead, the committees were powerful. And so institutionally, it's interesting to think about leadership power on a relative basis. Is the leadership powerful relative to the committee chairs? Is the leadership powerful relative to the individual members? Okay? How does the structure play this out? Okay, well, how do resources work here? Okay, what does that mean? Okay, these institutional theories in political science tend to focus on formal authorities. Let's look at the House rules and see what they allow the leader to do, and let's look at the House rules and see what they have the committee chairs allowed to do, and we'll figure it out. But most of the leaders don't have any formal authority. Okay, the whips have almost no formal authority. None. Okay, but what they do have is resources, money, and staff. Okay, so if we expand our perspective of what it means, what the institutional structure is, and talk about resources, we can see a wider picture of House and Senate leadership. Okay, well, why are resources important? Okay, and this is an informational theory of politics. Okay, start with the members, the relationship between the leader and the member. Members' time is scarce. Okay, they have a couple staffers helping them out who are busy answering phones and studying legislation all day. Okay, information is valuable. Okay, if you can produce more information, more evidence that your position is right, you're going to be able to dominate the political narrative, both inside the House and in public. The leadership can provide this. With the millions of dollars they have, they can have specialized policy experts who don't have to spend time answering constituent mail, but instead can spend time researching, producing, and disseminating knowledge. Okay? Members can then have a choice. They can trust the leadership's knowledge, or they can go try and expend their own resources to come up with their own. Most of the time, they have large incentives to trust the leadership. Okay? It's a reason members like taking their talking points from the leadership. It's because they don't have to spend their own resources building those talking points. Okay? Second, leaders can use these resources to build a whip system, which they have. Okay? Members don't really know what's going on in the chamber, how other members feel about things, but the leadership has 30 or 40 staffers running around the House all day, finding out how people feel and learning how people feel, and then regurgitating that information on a selective basis back to other members. Okay? As an individual member, you're in some ways flying blind in the House. You can try and figure out what's going on in other offices, but you don't really know. The leadership has staffers doing this for them. And finally, the leadership has these resources available to them to make a public case for legislation. Okay? Most members can afford a press secretary who can have a fair chance at getting a hold of a national media outlet, maybe. The leadership has dozens of staffers doing this. Okay? And so leadership ends up being not just authority, but the capacity to dominate information in both the internal and public narratives. Okay? And this is a wider issue than just Congress. Think about CBO. Prior to the creation of CBO, the president basically got the final say on what the economic numbers were. Congress creates CBO. They are now in the information game and compete with the president, okay, over the narrative. Okay, so let's talk about leadership funding. All this money going to the leadership is in the legislative branch appropriations bill. There's nothing below board here. This is all passed by law, signed by the president, and handed over. In 2010, it was a total of $47.5 million went to House and Senate leaders, okay, financially. 25 million about in the House, 21 million in the Senate, and that's slightly less than 2% of the total funding for each of the chambers. So we're not talking about a huge proportion of the chamber's money here. Pales in comparison to the 600 million spent for member offices money or the 200 million spent for committees, okay? And I want to differentiate between two types of this money. One is money going to the core leaders. That would be the speaker, the majority and minority leader, the whips, okay? And then money going to the political party operations, the policy committees and such. About 2/3 of the House money goes to these core leaders, and about 1/3 goes to the policy operations, for example. Okay? The funding structure is somewhat different in the chambers. In the House, the majority gets more money than the minority, which is somewhat reflective of the greater role the majority plays in the House. In the Senate, the money is evenly divided, dead down the middle, again reflecting the less agenda-setting power of the majority. But in both cases, the money is divided relatively evenly. In the House, 57% goes to the majority. And that reflects something like a well-professionalized legislature. If anyone's here from New York, I used to work in the New York State Senate. And back in those days, the majority got 92% of the money. That is not a well-professionalized legislature. That is a banana republic in some ways. So, of course, money is just instrumental. Having money is great, but what does it do? Well, in most cases, it buys staff. 90% of leadership money is spent on staff in the House and Senate. In effect, the running of the leadership office and the using these resources is the research, production, and management of information by people. Okay, now part of this is because you don't have to pay for your office at the Capitol or things like that, but mostly it's because this is what's useful. And the estimate is in 2010, there were about 400 people working in the leadership. Now again, that's not a lot of people. There's about 10,000 people working in Congress. Okay, so it's not a huge percentage of the people. And again, these people have very flexible assignments. If you look down a list of job descriptions of the leadership staff, it's all over the place. You can find right in the schedule office, scheduler, assistant scheduler, advanced director, policy director, deputy policy director, policy advisor, chief of staff, assistant to the chief of staff, press advisor, communications director, social media director. It goes on and on. Okay, but most of these people are in the business of information. So then there's a $64,000 question. What's going on here over time? Okay, we know the leadership's got more powerful recently. Do the resources comport to that? And so the second half of my paper looks at the relative resources of members, committee, and leaders over time. And that's important. The absolute value of the resources isn't really the big deal. Because in an information war, at least internally, the issue is what you have proportionally to others. Now, the absolute value might matter if you were thinking about how the legislative branch could deal with the president. But again, that would still be relative, just a different relative scale. Okay? And the bottom line here is that leadership resources have increased dramatically, while committee and member resources have not increased very much over the last 30 years. And the trend is absolutely unambiguous. Here is a chart adjusted for inflation and controlled $1982 of total leadership funding. Okay, and you can see that in 1982, total leadership funding was $9.7 million, and in constant $1982, now it's over $21 million. Okay, in effect, it's more than doubled over the last 30 years. And so an increase in the House of 239%, in the Senate of 177%. Now, of course, we don't really know unless we put that in perspective. And over the same time period, all non-leadership in the funding in the Senate increased by 37%, and all non-leadership funding in the House increased by 54%. Okay, so this is a massive increase in total leadership funding. Well, what is it translated to? Okay, well, this is a picture of leadership and committee staff. The dark line is leadership staff growth, and the dotted line is committee staff growth. Now, they're on two different scales. There's a lot more committee staffers than leadership staffers, but you can see the trend. The big dip in committee staff is 1995, when the Republicans took over and cut committee staff by 1/3, and you can see that has more or less never recovered. Okay, whereas leadership staff has steadily increased even in 95 and right through to today. Okay, and so overall in Congress, there's been an 11% increase in staff in the last 30 years. You can see committee staff has actually decreased somewhat in the last 30 years. Leadership staff and personal office staff have increased, but leadership staff much more so. And one thing in particular I wanted to highlight was what's going on in the Speaker's office. Now, this is a little deceptive because leadership staff is fungible. It can be moved around between the various accounts. But this shows you, how the leadership situation for the speaker today is just completely different than it was even for Tip O'Neill in the early 80s. The probability of being able to, quote unquote, write the health care bill in the speaker's office in 1980 was basically nil. Speaker O'Neill only had a dozen staffers. He had a dozen people in his office. He had less people in a leadership office than the average member had in a member's office. Okay, and you can see the two big jumps. The one is the well-known one, when Speaker Gingrich beefed up the speaker's office itself in the mid '90s, and the second one is what Speaker Pelosi did starting in 2007, and that one's much less well-known, I think. But that accounts for basically the entire jump, is those two speakers rearranging the powers of the office. And so I wanted to leave you with three basic conclusions that I bring from this. The first is that this is consistent with what we know about what's going on in Congress over the last 30 years, is that the leadership has become more powerful. But what's interesting here is this is a completely different process. When we talk about formally handing the leaders power, that occurs in the caucus meetings after elections in November, okay, and then in January when they write the House rules. Changes in the resources follow the appropriations track, okay, and so occur in the annual bills, which one need to be signed by the president and have the other chamber's approval, so it's a totally different type of game, but also occur at a different time of year, okay, and don't have that focus that we all hear so much about between November and January of a post-election year. What are they going to do? How powerful is the speaker going to be? What are they going to do with the committee chairs? Second, this is an utterly modern phenomenon. I think we're all well aware that there's been a historical cycle in the power of the leadership in the House, be it the powerful committees in the late 19th century, followed by the almost dictatorial power of Reed and Cannon as speakers, followed by the decentralization back towards the committees in Rayburn's day, back to now a more powerful a speaker, for instance, in the House. But this track is brand new. Speaker Cannon did not have very many staff. I think he had two. And so there's a question of whether these resources are going to smooth out any proposed deleveraging of this power. If we're going to reduce the power of the speaker, we're always also going to have to reduce his resources. Whether that can be done in the same way that a caucus can easily take away his formal authority is an open question. And the final thing is that we may be looking at a transformational moment here in legislative politics. Just like when the executive office of the president was put in and there was this bureaucratic beefing up of the executive branch leadership, we may be looking at kind of the same thing here. And that may have consequences both internal and external. The leadership may now have a buffer to maintain its power within Congress, but it also may have advantages vis-a-vis the president. A media machine in the House of Representatives might be a welcome addition if we want to think about legislative branch power in a separated power system facing off against the president who has 1,800 people working for him in the EOP. So I'll stop there, and after Colleen's talk, I'll be happy to field your questions.
Thanks, Matt. I want to thank Jacob for inviting me to participate in this book. I can say that this was a real joy of a chapter to write, probably second to the last words of my dissertation, which are always the best words you're ever going to write probably in your whole life. But this is a subject it's near to my heart and something that I actually got to participate in when I was a staffer in the Senate. And I always wanted to come back and write something about defense authorization and why I thought it was a very important process. And Jacob's edited volume gave me the opportunity to actually do that. So we're going to talk today, I'm going to tell basically a story, and I'm going to talk about the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the defense policy bill that's passed every year in Congress. In fact, it's been passed for 50 years in a row without fail. And in a time in which authorization processes are withering, this is quite an impressive accomplishment. Particularly, I'm going to focus on how the defense authorization bill passes in the Senate, how the Senate does its magic, given that the Senate is often thought of the place where legislation goes to die. And if you watch any of the political talk shows, you'll hear people complain about this a lot, that the Senate is the institution of gridlock, we can't get anything past the Senate. Well, that may be true in a lot of cases, but the Senate has passed the defense authorization bill for 50 years in a row, and I started with that puzzle. How could this possibly have happened? I wrote a sentence, and this is about a year ago whenever we were finishing up the chapters for this book, that as the 112th Congress began, reauthorization of surface transportation funding was several years late. There's no concerted movement toward Water Resources Development Act. No Child Left Behind is 5 years beyond its anticipated renewal, and movement towards a farm bill appears slow. And even though I wrote those words about a year ago, all those words are still true today. But yet the NDAA hit 49 years and it hit 50 years and it keeps on going, even in a super majoritarian and what people have described as a polarized Senate. And the last thing that I want to say about this, and I'll come back to this at the end, the other reason why I wanted to talk about defense authorization, why I wanted to write this piece, is that I truly think that it's a positive story about Congress. When you turn on the political talk shows today, you know, all you hear about is that approval ratings of Congress are 12, 13, 14, 15%. They're very low. There's not much good news coming out of Congress. And it's a lot about why Congress is failing and why Congress doesn't work. I think we have to pay attention to that, but we also have to pay attention to the flip side. What in Congress actually is working? And I think this is a positive story. We have to focus on that as much as we focus on the negative and what's not working. So today I'm going to talk about the NDAA process in the Senate. How does this bill get passed every year? What is the process that actually happens in the Senate, annually in the Senate? And then I'll talk about some of the factors. Why is it such? Why does it get passed every year? What are the particular aspects about this bill and the process in considering this bill that make it, enable it to actually become law each year? And then very briefly at the end, I'll talk about what this means for the Senate and the future of congressional policymaking. I'll talk about my methodology here. Most of this was based upon interviews with over 20 current and former Senate defense staffers, both the majority and the minority. People were very generous with their time. I spent a lot of breakfasts with Senate staffers before work and a lot of cocktails at the Monocle after work. They were very generous with their time. A lot of these people were individuals that I had worked with in the Senate when I was a staffer in the Senate, and I did work on 3 defense bills, FY 2007, 2008, and 2009, including the Markups. So that also enabled me to write this piece. So I'll talk a little bit about the committee process. How does this start out? Well, the gun goes off in February with the president's budget. The president's budget comes out and everything starts moving in Senate Armed Services. There's policy briefings, the Pentagon comes, staffers from both sides of the aisle come and listen to the Pentagon budget briefings, and that's really when the process starts. Very soon after that, very soon, maybe perhaps even a week later, the hearings begin. And they always start with the defense secretary and they move down with the combatant commanders, the service chiefs, and then the civilian department secretaries. And it's very methodical. If you could almost replicate the calendar year after year after year. Now the issues change, obviously. The defense issues are one way one year and another defense issue the next year. So the issues are always different. But the process and the procedure is always the same. You always know which witnesses are going to come at approximately what time, what's going to be considered at full committee, what's going to be considered in subcommittee. It's a very, very methodical process. The routinization of that process is extremely important in NDAA, and I'll talk more about that later. There's additional full committee hearings in February and March, and I think the key is that all these committee hearings have a purpose. The committee hearings are geared towards one thing, which is passage of the National Defense Authorization Act and developing a public record on the issues that will be legislated upon in the NDAA. The idea is to get all the important people in the room, get them on the record, let the senators have their questions, get the substance out there, and identify the issues that need to be addressed in the NDAA. So you start out with all these issues that are out there, and then they all kind of come to a head whenever you start to create the bill. But it's all a very deliberate process. This isn't just a picture of what a typical Senate Armed Services hearing looks like. That's with former Secretary Gates in the hot seat and all the senators lined up. And they're always in one of the 2 big hearing rooms in the Senate. Then after the full committee does its work and then the subcommittees do its work, Then you move towards Senate Armed Services Committee markup of the defense bill. And the markup is when the senators on the committee actually sit down in a room and they debate the bill, they amend the bill, and they rewrite the bill that is prepared for them, which is called the chairman's mark. It's usually completed in exactly 1 week. And actually right now, markup is going on in the Senate. This is a perfect time to be talking about this bill because the markup is taking place this week. They always bookend it before recess, so there's an incentive to get done in the markup. So they're very smart and strategic in that way. Something that's very different about Senate Armed Services and their markup of NDAA, which is different than other bills in the Senate and the House, is that most of the markup is done in closed session. And that's because that allows the senators and staff to move from classified session into open session very quickly. So they can talk about proprietary information or classified information without having to stop the markup, get everybody out of the room, move into closed session, and then open it back up again. So they've moved towards a closed markup in Senate Armed Services, and it's been that way for quite a while. It is a very different approach, and I'll come back to that later as well. Another unique aspect of the markup is what I call a building block approach. What they start with in armed services is what they agree upon. They don't start with what they disagree upon. So the minority and the majority get together as they're writing the bill and they say, okay, we can agree on about 90% or 95% of the things that we have to do this year in NDAA. And oftentimes that is the core of the bill. And I call it the building block approach. Instead of having a chairman's mark that is very partisan or very ideological, they actually start with a chairman's mark where most people can agree. And that creates a very, very different environment in markup than starting with a bill where one side is going to necessarily disagree with a lot of what's in the bill rather than the vast majority of what's in the bill. The professional staff work the markup to accept amendments suggested by senators on the committee, and this is also important because they're always creating buy-in to the bill. Instead of someone coming up to them and saying, okay, my senator, my boss wants to submit this amendment, and the professional staff look at it and they say, oh, we can't do that, sorry. Well, what are you going to do if you go back to your boss? Oh, well, he said we can't do the amendment. That's not going to engender much enthusiasm for the bill. Instead, what the professional staff have been trained to do and what they're practiced to do is to say, okay, we'll work with you on this amendment. We may not be able to take it the way you've written it. We may not be able to take 100% of what you're offering, but let's try to figure out a way that we can compromise and we can come to a solution so your boss can get his amendment in the bill. And that process occurs during markup. It's very collaborative. It's premised upon the idea that we want to get your boss's ideas in the bill. And compromises do keep the markup moving. And what happens is if you are stymied at a point during markup where there's an impasse, there's going to be a split vote, things are not looking good, they're arguing back and forth with each other, a lot of times the chairman will just say, that's it, stop, let's take a break. Everybody takes a break. Everybody goes to little corners of the room. And I thought this was fascinating in the times that I was in markup. And senators actually go themselves to the corners of the room and the 10-minute break and they work it out. We come back. There's a compromise. And they're able to do that. They're able to get that space because of the closed nature of the markup. I wrote in the chapter that compromise sometimes requires a degree of anonymity. And I really think that's true, and you see that in defense bill. There's other systematic processes that I won't go into a lot of detail with. The floor process is a lot like the markup process. If you have a boss that's not on armed services, but the committee staff obviously want him or her to vote for the bill, they will work with the personal office staff to get amendments accepted into the manager's package, which is the compromise package of amendments that can move forward to amend the bill. And there's a lot of emphasis on trying to strike deals so you can get amendments into the manager's package and build support for the bill. This is very deliberate, and the professional staff I talked to mentioned this over and over again as a strategy for moving the bill forward. And then the conference process, the staff does most of the work in the conference process and works out the disagreements between the House and the Senate. And they only bring the big four together, which is, both the ranking and the chairman of both the House and the Senate Armed Services Committee on a very small numbers of issues. That's only when staff cannot agree on what's going forward in conference. And there's a big four meeting, and then they finish the conference for the bill. for it's very deliberate and very systematic. And once again, it happens the same way every year. The issues are different, but the same way. So the question of why does it work? What is so special about this process? What's unique about this process? Well, there's bipartisanship really on a lot of levels. Yes, defense is a bipartisan issue in general, but there's been a lot of controversies in defense besides the 2 Iraq wars, tailhook, numerous contractor exposés. There's been a lot of things that there's been things that have divided the parties on in defense, but they've always figured out ways in which to interact in a bipartisan fashion. And it occurs on the staff level, but it also occurs from the top. This is what is really, I think, happened in armed services. When I tried to talk to staff, many of whom have been there for several decades, what they've said is chairmen come, chairmen go, rankings come, rankings go. But no matter who runs armed services, they have a belief and they're dedicated towards the idea that this committee will be run in a bipartisan fashion. And that is primary. And they only select staff that are going to work in a bipartisan fashion. So it's really a culture. Sometimes cultures start from the bottom and work their way to the top. I think this is really something that has started at the top and it's worked its way down in the bottom. I've talked about the routine processes, this repetition. So after you're a staffer on armed services 1 or 2 years, you get it. You know what's coming. You know what's going to happen next. And that routinization of process is really, really important because it's like somebody described it to me as like a steamroller. You're never going to stop it. The NDAA is this engine, and it's just this force that is bigger than the Senate. It's bigger than the majority leader. It's bigger than the minority leader. It just keeps going because the process is geared towards that one bill and towards getting it done. Staff interactions are really important. The staff travel together. The staff sit in the same office suite as each other. They all have one key to the office. And this was because of Richard Russell, who looked at that building that was being built across the street, Dirksen, and said, we're not moving over to that street. We're staying right where we are in the original Senate building, where we're going to be much more confined. But staff are just going to have to share the same quarters. We're not going to have a Republican suite and a Democratic suite. We're going to have one suite, and everybody's going to have the same key. And that really has amazing effects on how the staff interact with each other. They may not be the best of friends, but since the majority and minority switch so much these days, certainly there's repeated interactions, and the minority is always going to be consulted before the majority adds something in the chairman's mark. And then finally, something that I've mentioned also is the fact that it's closed markups. And this is very unique because it is a national security bill, and that's the reason why it is in closed markups. But it does allow this venue of compromise. I'm going to talk very briefly about something that almost tripped up the NDAA in fiscal year 2011, which is the case of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And you see there Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen testifying in front of Armed Services about Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This was a very difficult year, fiscal year 2011. In the beginning of the year, in one of the early hearings, Admiral Mullen informed Armed Services and informed the President that he was going to support the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell when he testified in February. It was not included in the markup, once again, but Senator Lieberman offered an amendment in markup to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and it was included. The amendment was accepted, and so it moved forward in the NDAA. When the NDAA came to the floor, then the cloture motion failed to proceed to the NDAA soon after that. And it was thought that at that point that possibly the NDAA was going to fail in fiscal year 2011, that there was not going to be a compromise. There was no way forward. How was it going to actually occur? And a game-changing event happened on November 30th when the Pentagon released a survey from military service members on the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And it was favorable for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And it resulted in 2 days of hearings in Senate Armed Services. And the procedure that was followed from that was that a standalone repeal was filed, was dropped in the Senate. It was then passed the Senate on December 18th. So you had that removed from NDAA. But then the question is, what do you do with NDAA? There had not been an amendment process. There hadn't been any successful cloture motion on a motion to proceed to the NDAA, and it was really at the end of the year. And what happened was described to me by staff as a Hail Mary effort to pass the NDAA, and it passed in both the House and the Senate on December 22nd by unanimous consent. 535 members of Congress, 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate, by unanimous consent. Nobody objected, in other words, to the passage of a pared down, albeit a fully intact NDAA. So the question of 2011 is, what was that? Was that the straw that broke the camel's back, or was it really the demonstrated strength of the NDAA? It had survived, but it was very bruised, and it was a very tumultuous process. When I asked staff that, and I was lucky enough to be able to interview people soon after this had occurred, it was very inconclusive. Half the people that I talked to said, we're done. Who knows what's going to happen? I don't think we're going to get, that was the 49th bill. Are we going to get to 50? It's not looking good. And then there was another portion of them that said, this was the worst. This is the worst we're ever going to see. It was the most controversial thing that we could have ever tackled. We figured out a way to get it through. The reason why we got it through is that we trusted each other, and we operated on a bipartisan basis. And when you go to the floor with UC, there is nothing but trust. That's the only thing, because anybody at any point in time can raise an objection and you are done. So there was nothing but trust when they went to the floor, when Levin and McCain hit the floor on the 22nd. And they said that really shows the strength of the process, because we were able to surmount that and we were able to get it through. But there's no doubt about it, no matter what, Armed Services says they plan to proceed as usual. They are going to continue to proceed on a bipartisan path. No matter what happens around them in the Senate, they are going to continue with the procedures that they've had in place. Closed deliberations continue to be under assault. They have had closed markups in the NDAA for a long time, but a lot of transparency advocates do not like the closed markup of NDAA, and they really are under assault. And there could be a time in which there's a vote taken in Armed Services to open up deliberations for NDAA, and it will have an effect on the passage of the bill. And also, the future of defense authorization is heavily dependent on leadership, really leadership of that committee. Are there going to continue to be chairmen and ranking members who really believe in the bipartisan mode of operations of that committee? If there continues to be that type of leadership, then it seems as though Armed Services will continue to produce a defense authorization bill every year without fail. If it's at some point there's not, then there will be an effect on the passage of the bill. And the last question is, can Senate Armed Services serve as a model for Congress? I think there's some lessons to be taken away. I think that bipartisanship, it came out very clear to me when I talked to people, is it's something that has to be cultivated over time. There's a culture in Armed Services, a culture of decades of operating this way. Even if you yourself are ideological and very partisan and you come to work there, you are not going to work there for very long. You're either going to not work there anymore or you're going to leave yourself. So it's a culture that has been cultivated, but it's from the top. It's from the chairs and the ranking members. This building a block approach to authorization bills, I think, is possible in other committees, starting with what is agreed upon rather than starting with what is disagreed upon. It is possible to do that in other committees. Closed markups are not possible in most other committees. The standing rules of the Senate prohibit it, so that is not something that can be widely replicated with other committees. But nonetheless, I still think that the bottom line, this morning I like to watch Morning Joe, and it's in the morning, and I saw that Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein were on, and I was watching them. And I do think that, they make some very good points about the problems that Congress is facing, and that there are some things about Congress that may indeed be broken. But I disagree with them in a lot of other ways, because I think that there's a lot of negative stories about Congress, and there's not a lot about what is actually getting done. What is getting done for the military personnel who depend upon this bill, the people who work at military bases that depend upon the construction projects that are in this bill, and the people that depend upon, the weapon systems that we develop that rely upon authorization in this bill. There are a lot of positive stories about Congress, and too often I think we do not focus on them.
Well, I'd like to thank Colleen and Matt and Jacob for their energetic, informed presentations. We're a little short on time, but we do have two of the speakers here, and I thought we might entertain a couple of questions for each of them, and then go to the book signing. And I will say the books are for sale outside at the Library of Congress price of $30. It normally goes for $35. And you can get them signed if you'll stick around, and we'll ask for a question. Are there questions for Colleen to start with? Would someone like to? Yes, Colleen, come on up.
Okay. One of the things that I saw in the variables that you think contribute to the passage of the NDA, one thing that's not there is the actual subject matter itself. Do you think the fact that it's defense and that might be something more compelling and overreaching than, let's say, the Farm Bill, which might have a more particular constituency, does that contribute more to the urgency in its passage?
Yeah, sure. Not every senator is intrinsically, passionate about having an installation in his or her state or anything like that. It is inherently more of a bipartisan issue, I think. There's other bipartisan issues. I mean, why hasn't there been, for example, a Water Resources Development Act passed? I mean, there's nothing more bipartisan than water projects. Everybody loves them. Everybody needs them. Sewer systems are deteriorating across the country, but we haven't been able to see a WRDA passed. I worked on the last WRDA. It's been years. And so I look at some of those other types of, aviation bill, things like that, aren't necessarily the same, aren't 100% comparable, but I think there are other examples where there's authorizing processes that have withered, and it might have to do with exactly the process more than anything else. Yeah, Maurice. Mm-hmm.
Taking off from aside from the subject area, is there any incentive today, and I'm not talking about in the 60s, but today, for any senator on any side of the court to vote against defense?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
Political?
Yeah, I think that there are votes against the defense bill every year, and I think that, someone like,
But does it affect, I mean, on a large scale to stop the process?
Well, there was a threat, actually. I'm not going to get into who it was, but there was a credible threat to stop the UC in FY 2011, and it had to be, there was drastic intervention to prevent someone from objecting on the floor. I don't think it involved physical restraint, but it may have. So there are detractors. And remember, this is not an appropriations bill, so you're not technically spending money, but the appropriations and the authorization process in defense are much, much more closely intertwined. The appropriators take the authorizers very seriously and use that mark to build the appropriations bill. So if you are someone who is very concerned about fiscal spending, things like that, and you really don't like the level of defense spending, which we know there are some members in the Senate and the House that are very opposed to those levels due to the fiscal health of the country, you would certainly have a problem with the defense authorization bill, because the authorization bill is the blueprint for the appropriators. And the appropriators take those numbers, and they sometimes tweak them, but they take those numbers as the base before they go forward in the defense appropriations bill. So,
Had much more of a problem in the 60s and the early 70s during Vietnam.
Oh, right. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And what I'm trying to say to you is that there is an anti-war position today that is the dominant moral position, and any member of Congress who attacks, legitimately attacks the whole process is not going to last very long. And the other issue is, has the legislative appropriations bill ever not passed?
I don't think that's. I don't know. I don't know. Well, it would have.
The Ledge Branch bill? Right?
Well,
Ledge Branch bill
No,
not.
December 95 it didn't pass.
Yeah, but that was because the Congress closed.
well, it doesn't always.
They
Defense
shut down the
appropriations
entire process.
doesn't. It sometimes does not move standalone, though. I mean, right. The NDAA is standalone. It's not. Defense appropriations sometimes is rolled in an omnibus, or I mean. The government to operate has, everything has to pass at some point in time. So it's really not the same.
All I'm at point
Yeah.
is that there's a lot of times when authorization.
But actually, I will tell you
Other issues.
that on Iraq, right, the Iraq debate was not on defense authorization. The authorizers punted Iraq. They kept it off. Where the debate in the Senate, and I don't know about the House, I was following it in the Senate, the debate on Iraq was in defense appropriations. That's where the big debates are, and that's where there was the really controversial amendments and all those other things was on appropriations, not on the authorizing bill. And they worked hard, the authorizers. We're going to focus on military policy and defense policy in this bill. This is not going to become a committee in where we, just debate Iraq. And that was on the appropriators.
I guess my point is that there's a lot of politics involved in this, apart from the fact that you have a successful culture.
Yeah, right.
The fact of the matter is the successful culture may be driven by the fact that the people who are driven by money going back home, being successful and being reelected, and apart from just the institution.
Right, and I do talk about, I did not mention it, but I do talk about the log rolling and the parochialism in the chapter.
Colleen, let me see, are there any questions for Matt? Here we go. Matt, come on up. Thank you very much.
Yes.
I have a question for both of you, but I'll start with yours.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious to know, like, with this increase in staff and leadership offices and the creation of information, processing of information, is there any evidence that it's actually doing anything?
Well, I mean,
they're not processing bills any faster. They don't seem
Sure.
to be, any more or any less reliant.
Well, there's no evidence that increased information leads to more legislative output. I think that a better argument would be that it shapes what the output is when you do have output. I don't have a specific example from leadership output, but I think if you look at the healthcare bill, I think it's very clear that if CBO didn't exist, it would have been a very different bill because the president's numbers would have become the rock solid gold standard for the bill rather than CBO's numbers. And those numbers were very different and tremendously shaped the debate. Now, it's a different informational field, but it's a different informational field, right? If it was 1972 and the healthcare bill was going through and Congress had no way to generate information in a budget office by itself, I think it would have been a very different outcome. And so I think the same is true for leadership. Now, I mean, I think the environment's larger because the other people providing information in a new way now are our interest groups. If anything, from an individual member's point of view, it's not so much that leadership is giving you a take this or leave it, but there's a lot more opportunities to get information. In some ways, the leadership is compete.
Are you coordinating between member offices, or are they trying to facilitate certain things, or votes?
Well, I mean, I think the whip's office is a good place to think about this. Okay, when the whip's office had 8 staffers in 1980, their ability to figure out how their caucus felt about things on the fly was limited. They could run around the office buildings and try and talk to as many people in person as they can and try and twist as many arms as they could. But with 45 staffers, it's a whole different ballgame. They can get to people a lot faster. And I think that shows. I mean, part of the leadership's goal here is to keep people in the dark. The leadership wants to know as much as it can without giving away as much as it can to people who might be on the fence. If you're dealing with blue dogs, for instance, say Ms. Pelosi is dealing with blue dogs, and she needs 10 votes, okay? She doesn't want the blue dogs to know she needs 10 votes. She wants every blue dog to think she needs 2 votes so that they better make their deals before someone else makes, their own deals. So when you're bargaining with individual members to try and capture their vote, having the information and having staff who can get the information, not just produce charts that show things, but literally find out what's going on in the office buildings makes a big deal, big difference. Royce?
Two things. One, your chart with respect to the actual cost for the speakers literally showed that the increase was due to 2 people.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Now, is this a question, from your point of view,
Right.
is this a question of those 2 people's personalities? You referred to Johnson and has his ability.
Sure.
Is it a question of their personality, or is it a question of historical importance at the point in time? Here you had,
Right.
for the first time, a Republican
Yeah.
speaker.
No,
of
I
the
think that's
House
right.
For, I guess it was about 45 years.
Yeah. No.
And then you have a woman who becomes the first female Speaker of the House. These are important events. The spending to make sure that they succeed.
Sure.
Is that
No,
possible?
I mean, I don't think it had. Look, I think Gingrich and to a lesser degree Pelosi were a product of their caucuses and of their times, and so the fact that Gingrich, the Speaker's office was drastically beefed up in size under Gingrich, I don't think it was necessarily Gingrich himself, but I do think the Republicans in 1995 were going to put a Gingrich-like figure in command. Period. And I think it was also true of the Democrats in 2007, that this was their time. And they were going to increase the power of the leadership because the caucuses were more unified. I mean, I do really think it's an institutional issue. If we snapped our fingers and all of a sudden it was 1960 and Democrats were in control, they would rip apart, I think, these resources pretty quickly, because none of the Southerners would assent to the idea of a leadership this powerful that could steamroll them. And so I don't think it's the men and women themselves. Although, I mean, I do think, as with LBJ, I do think individual ability counts for something. But I do think that the growth of the Speaker's office is bigger forces than just Newt or Nancy.
I'm sorry, Kevin, do you have the last question?
No, I'll take it to him outside.
Okay, well, thank you. Let's go to the book signing. One more round of applause for our two speakers for a wonderful program. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.